Good morning. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Falmouth. I am Robert Foose, a member of the Falmouth Veterans Council, and I will be your Master of Ceremony for today's Memorial Day observance. On behalf of the town of Falmouth, I welcome you and thank you for being a part of today's special ceremony and spending a portion of your holiday weekend with us. Unlike Veterans Day, which celebrates all men and women who have served in the United States Armed Forces, Memorial Day remembers and honors the more than 1.3 million service members that made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. At this time, I would like to recognize some of the special guests we have with us here today. Congressman Keating and his staff, State Representative Vieira, Dylan Fernandez, Acting Town Manager Peter Johnson-Stamm, our Select Board, Nancy Taylor, Edwin Zielinski, Doug Brown, Angela Scott-Price, and Robert Mascali, the Assistant Deputy Superintendent of Sheriff Buckley's Office, Don Doyle, Acting Police Chief Brian Lewin, and Fire Chief Tim Smith. We also have our Veteran Services staff, Don Lincoln and Julie Cadigan. Our Falmouth Veterans Council, Chair Carissa April, Bill Doherty, Brian Hodor, Ron Nassif, Paula Smith, and Elizabeth Sweeney. And Al Beal, Chief Warrant Officer, U.S. Coast Guard retired, with the Scouting Groups of Falmouth. Welcome. Please remain standing for the opening prayer by Pastor Rene Perez of John Wesley United Methodist Church.
Let us pray. Gracious God, on this day we pause to remember the sacrifices made for freedom throughout the history of our nation. As we remember those who have served and who in serving offered their lives, help us to be grateful. Help us to remember that the peace we enjoy, the freedoms we cherish, and the justice we defend were gained and granted at the costly price of the lives of brave women and men who dreamed of a better world. God, you are our tower of strength, our refuge, and our everlasting hope. And we pray that on this day you will give us the courage and wisdom to be able to honor the dreams, the memory, and the sacrifices of those who gave their all. God, you who made the heavens, the stars, and the earth, and everything in it, grant us a spirit of resilience, a compassionate heart, and a desire to do good in the world, so that the sacrifice of those who are now with you may bring forth undying justice and peace. Lord, watch over us and over those who now serve in our armed forces, especially those far away from home. Above all, give us open hearts and open minds, so that in seeking peace, we may find love for one another. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Perez. Now the combined Falmouth School Band will perform our national anthem. Junior Girl Scout from Troop 82164 and a 5th grader at Morse Pond. Zach Jones, a first-class scout from Scout BSA Troop 42 and an 8th grader at St. John Paul Prep. Braden Simpson, a Weeblo Cub Scout from Cub Scout Pack 41 and a 4th grader at Mullen Hall. And Danette Landre, a Life Scout from Scouts BSA Troop 38 and a 10th grader at Sturgis, will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Scout salute. Detail. Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you, Scouts. Those with seats may be seated. The Brian Baru Pipe Band will now perform Minstrel Boy. Thank you. It is my distinct honor to introduce today's keynote speaker, Colonel Joshua Romano, Massachusetts Army National Guard. Colonel Romano has 31 years of service and is currently the Deputy Brigade Commander of the 151st Regional Support Group. He spent 5 years drilling at Camp Edwards as the base personnel officer and as commander of a training unit. He has deployed to Iraq twice and once to Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, and serves as a high school principal in his civilian career. Please join me in welcoming Colonel Romano.
Good morning. You know, I love being on Cape Cod. My grandparents lived in Harwich, and I spent my summers here when I was growing up. And then years later, I was assigned to Camp Edwards for more than 5 years, and I really enjoyed my routine here. I had they knew my drink order at the Falmouth 99. I had a favorite locker at Planet Fitness, but mostly I loved the work that I did at Camp Edwards. There is this amazing base right here on Cape Cod that does so many great things for our soldiers and airmen. And I know that the relationship between the base and the community hasn't always been perfect. I remember letters my grandmother wrote to General Vecina in the 90s, but I wanted to focus on what my experience as a soldier has been coming to Camp Edwards over the last 3 decades, really, and the impact that the base has had on our national defense and the soldiers who have passed through here. I don't know that the community here always knows just how much your support means to us at Camp Edwards. In my civilian life, I'm a high school principal. My job is to hire and evaluate instructors, develop curriculum, and discipline students who misbehave. So the National Guard made me a commander at the Regional Training Institute at Camp Edwards, where my job was also to hire and evaluate instructors, develop curriculum, and discipline students who misbehave. And I loved it. For those who are not familiar with the RTI, we run programs that train officer candidates, warrant officers, new company commanders and first sergeants, drone operators, and medics. We have classes that teach people to jump out of helicopters, set up landing zones for paratroopers, and get people ready for the challenges of Ranger School. We develop leaders at every level. The history of the RTI is often read during ceremonies in a very serious tone. I presided over a lot of those ceremonies in my time, and it goes something like this. The Regional Training Institute was founded in 1912 as the mass military academy with the purpose of training officers and leaders. We were the first state to set up a program of this kind, and it eventually served as the model for other states. And we continue to do that work today. Right now, the 99th class of Officer Candidate School is preparing for their final training session. In over 100 plus years, we have had over 1,000 officers commissioned through the RTI, and more than 100 of them have made the rank of colonel or general. And that is a huge legacy of achievement. But there's a lot more to the story than those statistics. There's an impact that goes far beyond the serious and that kind of boring history that we roll out at every ceremony. Because those numbers represent real people, young men and women who had hopes and aspirations, whose careers in the military meant that they lived through moments of joy, of frustration, of terror, who experienced the camaraderie that can only be experienced during the deep kind of suffering and sadness that can come with serving in a time of war. And most importantly, they were all people who had a desire to serve their country and make a difference in some of the most challenging settings that people can endure. Over the last 110 years, the Institute has commissioned officers who led U.S. soldiers into combat in World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, the Persian Gulf War, Bosnia and Kosovo, and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that responsibility of leading other people into combat and danger, people who aren't just soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardsmen, but people who are husbands and wives, sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, grandchildren and friends. Well, that responsibility is a huge thing to place on someone. But we endure and we persevere in that immense obligation to those soldiers and all the loved ones who are waiting and worrying about them at home. And we're able to do that because of the training that we received right here in Cape Cod. So what is it like for soldiers at the RTI? I've done a number of courses there, and it's a very unique experience. When I was in officer candidate school, we had to report on Friday nights, and the only thing harder to get through than Friday night bridge traffic to the Cape is Sunday afternoon traffic off the Cape. And sitting in the bridge, waiting to arrive at OCS, you had a lot of time to think about how hard the weekend was going to be. And I'll admit, I did circle around the Rotary a couple of times, delaying that arrival at Camp Edwards, just psyching myself up. And once on the base, we spent the next 40 hours or so getting yelled at, doing push-ups, doing flutter kicks, trying to get 6 hours of work done in every hour. If you've seen Full Metal Jacket and An Officer and a Gentleman, it's kind of somewhere in between there. For me personally, the hardest thing was the geese. I know the geese are a problem here in parts of the Cape. I remember a story that was done in the Chronicle here about using fake coyotes to scare away the geese. The geese are on base too, and they could use a couple of those stuffed coyotes because there is nothing like having to low crawl across a field covered in goose droppings. Beyond the rigors of dodging goose droppings, we also walked everywhere. We did pull-ups before every meal, and we had to plan how we were going to get to training, and the whole while, people were yelling at us. We learned to think under pressure, to focus on the task when there's chaos all around us, to think fast and make a plan quickly and get the job done. I like to think that those qualities have been a help to me in my civilian job as well. When we plan our safety drills or when there's a medical emergency in the school, I can make a quick plan that gets the job done. I also plan graduation the way we plan military operations. I write an operations order with maps and phases and tasks to subordinate units. My staff either finds it charming or annoying. It's a mix, but they all agree that it gets the job done. And those are skills that I learned right here in Cape Cod at the RTI. My first experience with the RTI was in 1995. I joined when I was 17, so I am well preserved, but also have a long service record already. I got a call asking if I wanted to go to something called FST school. Well, I was young. I didn't know what FST stood for. You couldn't just Google it. So I thought fire support team, artilleries and cannons and cool stuff like that. Well, FST actually stands for field sanitation team. Instead of learning about artillery, I learned about toilets. But since that introduction to the RTI, I've gotten to see the whole range of courses that they run. I've come here for expert infantry badge testing, officer candidate school, pre-command, instructor training, combat lifesaver, and I've evaluated instructors who are teaching flight medics, advanced first aid. They actually taught me how to do sutures using a chicken leg, so you really don't want me to be the one doing your stitches, but I suppose I could do it. I've observed the flights of Raven drones. Once I was out in the field watching them fly, and the first time I saw them, the operator was bringing in a Raven to land. And I was thinking, it seems like it's coming in pretty fast. And then it hit the ground like a lawn dart. And pieces of it went flying everywhere. It tumbled end over end, and I thought, this must be like $1 billion in Pentagon money. I was kind of quietly freaking out inside. Everyone else stayed calm and cool, so I did too. You learn to stay calm when you're crawling across the field covered in goose poop while someone is yelling at you. And then I learned that that's just how they land. They break apart and then they just kind of snap back together like Legos. And I was relieved. I've also observed classes on topics from nutrition to counseling victims of sexual assault, to how to tie a rappel sprig, to how to call for artillery fire. I did finally get that artillery cannons class in. All of that happens right here. On this base, we have facilities where soldiers can practice shooting on a simulated range under any conditions of darkness or rain, or use a computer to practice calling an artillery fire and seeing if you gave them the right targeting information. We have an obstacle course, a confidence course, a leadership reaction course where team leaders have to make a plan to get an ammo case across an obstacle without falling into some very dirty water below. We have a simulated base like the kind we used in Iraq and Afghanistan, complete with towers and gates. We have land navigation courses. We have a gym and a beautiful running course that goes through the woods. We have a debris pile where engineers practice rescuing people from rubble after a building collapse or terrorist attack. We have a simulated village to practice urban combat. I was actually at that site about a year ago helping to teach warrant officer candidates. They had to do a mission in which they had to locate and rescue me. And the two candidates who fought their way into the building that I was in, two very young candidates, neither of them over 5'3". They helped me up and one of them said, "Figures he's big." I was a little offended. I do assume that she meant muscular and tall. I was very tempted to go dead weight on them. I did not. But the next day I was teaching them about the attributes of leaders, and one of them is being tactful. And I used the incident of the candidate saying, "Figures he's big," as an example of not showing tact. We had a nice laugh, well I did anyway, at her expense. All of these resources are right here at Camp Edwards. Our last accreditation a few years ago, we had an almost perfect score. We were one of only 3 RTIs in the country out of 56 or so to have that high of a score. That's the legacy that this, oh, yes, thank you. I only own about a fraction of 1% of that. That's the amazing legacy that this base has provided for the countless men and women who have passed through here. And that's also my own personal history with Camp Edwards and the RTI. I have almost 32 years of service, and there's hardly been a year when I didn't spend a good chunk of it right here. So after 32 years, people ask me why I am still in the service. I could have retired a long time ago. But I still serve, and I think a lot of my fellow soldiers still serve, because we believe that what we do makes a difference. What we do improves the lives of those with us and those of our fellow Americans. We all share a commitment to serving our country at war or serving your community in times of need, as we so often do for tornadoes, snowstorms, hurricanes, or the training that we do to be prepared in the event of a terrorist attack. You can call that feeling whatever you want: warrior spirit, self-sacrifice, duty, honor, country. I like to keep things simple. And what I think that it all really means is hope. It's a simple word, hope, just 4 letters, that carries so much weight. We have hope that we can make a difference in the lives of others. We hope that our children can grow up in a safe world. Hope that our sacrifices will make the world a better place. Hope for a better tomorrow. And there's nothing on earth that's more powerful than that hope. I think that every man and woman who puts on this uniform hopes that their service will bring us one step closer to a better world. Which brings me right back to this space here in your community and the real meaning of Memorial Day. The men and women who have passed through Camp Edwards in their service to the nation over the decades have all done so in that spirit of hope. Many made the ultimate sacrifice for their nation, which is what this day commemorates. A time to remember those soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who made the ultimate sacrifice in their commitment to a better world. We remember them as the husbands and wives, sisters and brothers, sons and daughters, mothers and fathers, and the friends that they also were. This is a day that transcends political divisions and unites us all in the remembrance of those we have lost. Franklin Roosevelt wrote, "Those who have long enjoyed such privileges as we enjoy forget in time that men have died to win them. Today is the day that we make sure we remember them." For myself personally, in some quiet place later today, I'll think back on the friends and fellow warriors who I worked with and lived with that went overseas in their service to their country and did not live to see their homes again. And also the growing number of friends who came home in body but had been broken in spirit and took their own lives when they deserved a long life of peace. For them, we cannot allow the cost of peace to exceed the cost of war. In Henry V, Shakespeare described weary soldiers after a battle with these words: "We are but warriors for the working day. Our guilt may be all besmirched by rainy marching in the painful fields, but by the mass, our hearts are in the trim." Henry's soldiers are still proud warriors at heart, even though they're ragged, exhausted, and filthy after the long battle in the muddy fields of France. And that brings me right back around to those goose droppings. So I may also call up some old friends from officer candidate school and talk about crawling across those fields, as well as remember the good friends that we've lost. Sometimes the laughter can be as cathartic as the tears. Thank you so much for inviting me to be here today, and on behalf of every soldier, sailor, airman, Coast Guardsman, and Marine who ever had the privilege of working and training on Camp Edwards, I thank you for your graciousness, your hospitality, and your support over the years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colonel. The combined Falmouth School Band will now perform America the Beautiful. Thank you. Men and women from Falmouth have fought in each of this nation's wars. For those that have walked the cemeteries around town, scouts and volunteers have ensured American flags are proudly waving from the tombstones of those who have fought in each conflict, from the most current wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, all the way back to the Revolutionary War. In the military, a roll call is the reading aloud of the names on the muster roll, and their responses determine who is present or accounted for. Today, we will conduct a roll call for those veterans laid to rest here on Memorial Lane in front of the Falmouth Library who gave their lives in service to their country. Will the audience please rise for the Memorial Lane roll call? From the Persian Gulf, Sergeant Matthew Gallagher, Army. From the Vietnam War, Corporal Langdon Burwell, Marines. Specialist Arthur Hennessy Jr., Army. Private First Class John Burgess, Army. Corporal Bernard St. Jean, Marines. Lieutenant Edward Mello Jr., Army. Lieutenant Anthony Kupka, Marines. From the Korean War, Lieutenant George Toe, Army. Private First Class James Nickerson, Marines. And Private First Class Alexander Booker, Army. From World War II, William McComiskey, Navy. Staff Sergeant Charles Norris, Air Force. Private First Class Clarence Mellons, Army. Private First Class Ernest Barrows, Army. Corporal Leonard Fonseca, Air Force. Private Joseph Eusebio Jr., Army. Lieutenant Alfred James, Air Force. Chester Weeks, Navy. Staff Sergeant Joseph Spooner, Army. Lieutenant Stephen Papp, Army. Private Leonard Almeida, Marines. Lieutenant Robert Larkin, Air Force. And Airman Frank Cardoza, Navy Air Corps. And from World War I, William Martin. William Wood. Charles DeWillis. William Savage. And Paul Sherman, Jr. As a Coast Guardsman, we have a saying in the seagoing services: those who are no longer in the ranks of the living have crossed the bar, referencing Lord Alfred Tennyson's poem of the same name, Crossing the Bar. Sunset and evening star, and one clear call for me, and may there be no moaning of the bar when I put out to sea. But such a tide as moving seems asleep, too full for sound and foam, when that which drew from out the boundless deep turns again home. Twilight and evening bell, and after that the dark, and may there be no sadness of farewell when I embark. For though from out our bourne of time and place the flood may bear me far, I hope to see my pilot face to face when I have crossed the bar. Each year, too many of Falmouth's heroes have crossed the bar. To honor these brave men and women, the Falmouth Genealogical Society has compiled a list of Falmouth's fallen heroes based on obituaries in the Falmouth Enterprise. This is our first time in several years sharing the list of Falmouth's fallen heroes. So if you have a seat and need to sit, please do so. I will be joined at the podium by members of the Falmouth Veterans Council, our chair Carissa April, Brian Hodor, Paula Smith, and Elizabeth Sweeney. And now, Falmouth's fallen heroes.
Duncan Payne Aspinwall, Army. Charles J. Atkinson, Army. Malcolm A. Austin, Marines. Robert J. Averill, Marines. Richard James Barber, Marines. Lloyd S. Beckett, Jr., Air Force. Mary L. Bell, Navy. Walter S. Bennett, Jr., Air Force. Kenneth N. Benoit, Marines. Gilbert H. Berkeley, Army. Charles Edward Berkeley, Air Force. Albert B. Bebo, Navy. Kenneth E. Brereton, Navy. Richard Stewart Brereton, Sr., Marines. Anthony Michael Brianna, Navy. Joseph F. Bucchiano, Marines. William C. Byrne, Army. William Albert Camilio, Air Force. Lawrence L. Cameron, Navy. James M. Canty, Navy. Philip James Cedrone, Navy. John William Child, Army. Edward Hinckley Shute, Coast Guard. Thomas E. Colborn II, Army. William H. Coffey, Air Force.
Donald Francis Coleman, Army. Louis R. Colombo, Army. Artist Vi Comer, Navy. Joseph Allen Cook, Navy. David H. Kuhn, veteran. William J. Corcoran, Marine. John R. Costa Sr., Navy. Stephen Coughlin, Marine. Eugene Redmond, Crimmins, Navy. Albert W. Croft, Jr., Air Force. James M. Crossan, Navy. David Cummings, Air Force. Frank T. D'Amato, Jr., Air Force. Fernand A. Delp, Navy. John W. Dalton, Air Force. Philip Neer Doust, Jr., Air Force. Bryce Allen Dawson, Air Force. Lawrence DeMello, Navy. Leonard Wolclaw D'Amico, Air Force. John E. Downey, Coast Guard. Stephen Jude Doyle, Marines. Frederick C. Dreyer, Jr., Army. John J. Duffy, Army. William P. Duggan, Army. John E. Duggan, Navy.
Richard DeBosky, Air Force. George Albert Engstrom, Navy. John Stanley Erickson, Jr., Coast Guard. Vincent J. Falcone, Jr., Army. Joseph Natalio Famia, Army. Paul A. Baraka, Sr., Air Force. Stephen Sloat Fassett, Army. Louis Ferretti, Army. William Benjamin Fleck, Army. Francis W. Furtado, Air Force. Richard E. Gaquette, Army. David A. Genero, Navy. Michael S. Graham, Marines. John F. Graham, Army. Arthur Neville Hampton, Army. Julian F. Hardwood, Marines. George Stedman Hatch, Army. John W. Kineo, Air Force. Curtis E. Hill, Marines. Rogers C. Hooper, Navy. Quinton E. Hughes, Jr., Air Force. Lawrence Edward Humber, Army. John Jarboski, Army. Jake Jesperson, Coast Guard. Christus George Kalopoulos, Army.
Nicholas T. Karolikis, Navy. William George Kelly, Army. Victor H. Kester, Navy. Daniel Kirby, Army. Harley J. Knievel, Navy. Elliot Swift Lawrence, Navy. Edward J. Leary, Army. George H. Liebhertz, Jr., Air Force. Erwin J. Liederman, Army. Thomas P. Leonard, Army. Richard Lopes, Air National Guard. Vernon Silent Drum Lopez, Army. Gary Lee Lowe, Air Force. Kevin Kerr Lynch, Army. Leonard Francis Lynch, Jr., Army. Donald E. Mack, Navy. John Peter Maharis, Army. Demosthenes Anthony Markin, Army. David Marshall, Air Force. John Edward Martin, Army. Joseph Charles Martina, Air Force. Thomas L. Matthews, Jr., Army. Frederick C. McCardle, Coast Guard, Merchant Marine. Taylor Kenneth McIntyre, Army. William John McKay, Jr., Army.
Joseph McLeish, Army. James Edward McNiff, Army, Navy. Edward Viveros Mello, Army. Lois Mercado, Navy. Timothy Mark Meserve, Air Force. Ralph B. Mills, Army. David W. Mitchell, Army. Norman W. Morrison, Army. Joseph M. Mulvey, Jr., Army. John Murner, Army. Ellsworth F. Nightingale, Jr., Coast Guard. Richard Francis Nisi, Air Force. Clifford Thompson O'Connell, Navy. Michael Joseph O'Connor, Air Force. Ernst Oberg, Army. John Anastasia Orfanos, Army Air Force. Raymond A. Payson, Air Force. William Francis Peffer, Army. Henry Roderick Peters, Jr., Marines. Warren K. Keith Pina, Army.
George K. Powers, Air Force. Richard Roland Pryor, Army. Joseph E. Rabbit, Navy. Robert Louis Rabeska, Sr., Navy. Robert J. Reddy, Navy. John A. Ryan, Navy. Frederick T. Riley, Navy. Robert Francis Robideau, Air Force. Lawrence F. Rochi, Marine. Emmanuel P. Ramusa, Air Force. Jeffrey B. Rose, Navy. Paul A. Ross, Marines. Edward Lavino Ray, Air Force. Marjorie A. Rugen, Navy. Eugene L. Rush, Air Force. Arthur Ernest Ryman, Air Force. James R. Sawyer, Air Force. Walter Carpenter Scanlon, Army. Thomas Francis Scanlon, Army. Milton G. Scrapella, Navy.
William R. Scollins, Navy. Joseph Chip Shadak, Navy. Stephen E. Shaw, Army. Jean Lee Simpson, Marines. Sumner Elliott Schuyler, Navy. William Jerome Smith, Army and Merchant Marine. Donald L. Smith, Army. Robert W. Smith, Navy. Stephen Raymond Soares, Marines. Ronald J. Souza, United States Air National Guard. Harold J. Sparks, Jr., Army. Edward T. Stafford, Navy. Justin Stefanik, Air Force. Thomas Reed Stenson, Army. Edward Sutton Stimson III, Army. John William Stimson, Air Force. Stephen Clark Stressinger, Coast Guard. Robert E. Struthers, Navy. Lolita Sultanat, Navy. Manuel L. Sylvester, Jr., Army.
Frederick Ciro Torin, Army. Raymond Mason Toe, Navy. Charles A. Truss, Army. Edward T. Van Buren, Air Force. Kenneth Lee Ventura, Army. Joseph S. Vitale, Navy. Brett E. Wadsworth, Army. Patrick S. Walsh, Army. Stephen Walsh, Air Force. Raymond Douglas Warner, Army. Willard C. Weaver, Army. William Bryan Wellman, Army. Perry S. White, Army. Richard F. Williams, Navy. Miles H. Winkler, veteran. Thomas F. Woodring, Army. John Douglas Yeary, Army. Paul Henry Yelp. Navy. Robert A. Young, Air Force. Lawrence Zimble, Marines. Edward P. Zielinski, Army.
The gift of flowers at a memorial site is a ritual that occurs around the world and is understood in every culture. The floral tributes at funerals bespeak both the beauty and brevity of life. The Falmouth Garden Club will now present flowers while the Brian Baru Pipe Band performs Amazing Grace.
My man.
Thank you. Pastor Perez will now deliver the closing prayer.
Honor guard. Parade. Rush.
God, as we are reminded of those who sacrificed everything, their comforts, their hopes, their families, and ultimately their lives for the freedoms we enjoy. Help us to never forget. It seemed overwhelming to hear so many names of people who have died at this cost. Help us to remember their faces, their names, their love for country. Help us to never forget why we value freedom. And as we continue to bear the heartaches of loss and grief in the absence of those we loved, God, we pray for you to comfort their families. And we ask you, God, for you to bless us in this solemn moment of remembering. Strengthen our hearts and the hearts of our nation. God, we pray all this for the sake of those who are no longer with us. Amen.
Thank you, Pastor Perez. Please be seated. In closing, we have many to thank for making this ceremony possible. Thank you to today's performers, the combined Falmouth School Band and the Brian Baru Pipe Band. You are an integral part of the rich musical tradition of Falmouth's Memorial Day and Veterans Day ceremonies. Thank you to the Scouts for your support, not only during today's ceremony and parade, but for all you do to benefit our local community. And to your parents who support you. Thank you to the Falmouth Fire Department for the grand flag flying on the west side of the library lawn. Thank you to Val's Floral Design Studio for donating the flowers here on Memorial Lane and for the Deacons Avenue ceremony later today. Thank you to Jeremiah Pearson and his crew at the DPW and Parks Department for the beautiful job they always do here on the grounds at Memorial Lane. Also, thank you Ralph Wadley and Tim Martin of the Falmouth Genealogical Society for researching and preparing the names of Falmouth's fallen heroes. This is a revival of an old tradition we had here for Memorial Day. Thank you for your assistance to make that possible. Thank you to our combined color guard, the Falmouth Fire Department, the Coast Guard, the Scouts, and the Elks Lodge. We're also lucky to have our own dedicated Veterans Services staff here in Falmouth. Thank you, Julie Cadigan and Don Lincoln, for all the support you provide to veterans and their families, and for all the planning that goes into these ceremonies. A few more announcements. The Oak Grove Cemetery will hold a walking tour today at 1 o'clock, featuring Falmouth men who made the ultimate sacrifice for our freedom. Learn about veterans from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. The Skylark Choir will perform a free concert this afternoon at 3 p.m. at the Lawrence School Auditorium in honor and recognition of our veterans and active duty service members. There will be a light lunch served at the Elks Lodge located at 140 Palmer Avenue, sponsored by the Joe Q Coffee Break. And at 12, there will be the laying of the wreath ceremony at the Sailors Memorial with the U.S. Coast Guard and Sea Scouts, located on Deacons Avenue by the harbor. And finally, thank you. We are always blown away by how many come to observe Memorial Day and Veterans Day with us here on Memorial Lane, rain or shine. Thank you for being here today. Now will the audience please rise for the retiring of the colors. Color guard, retire the colors.
Color guard, look, look. Port, arm. Right, face. Forward, march.
This concludes today's ceremony. Thank you for joining us for Falmouth's 2023 observance of Memorial Day.